Here's a number that tells you more about the first hours of this war than almost any other single fact. In the opening period of Operation Epic Fury, Iran's internet connectivity reportedly dropped to somewhere around 4% of its normal traffic level. Not from a single missile, not from a bomb hitting a data center. From a deliberate, coordinated effort to sever the digital and electromagnetic nervous system of a country before a single strike aircraft crossed its border. That's the part of this war that never makes it into the dramatic footage. Nobody films a jammed radar screen. Nobody puts a collapsed communications network on the evening news the way they put a collapsing building on it. But by most credible accounts, the actual opening move of this conflict on February 28, 2026, wasn't a bomb at all. It was something closer to darkness, a systematic effort to make Iran's air defense network blind and its command structure deaf before the kinetic campaign that followed ever got underway. Let's go through what's actually documented here, because the electronic warfare side of this war is real, significant, and undercovered, but it's also the part of the story most prone to exaggeration, since a lot of what circulates about it comes from defense industry blogs with an obvious interest in making next-generation jamming technology sound as close to magic as possible. The goal here is to separate what's solidly reported from what's closer to marketing copy, dressed up as battlefield reporting. The doctrine isn't new. The execution might be. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, coordinated space and cyber operations disrupted Iranian communications and sensor networks ahead of the main kinetic strikes, with the explicit goal, in his own words, of leaving the adversary disrupted, disoriented, and confused. That's not a throwaway phrase. It describes a specific objective, not just denying an enemy the ability to see incoming aircraft, but making that enemy uncertain whether the data on their own screens can be trusted at all. That kind of uncertainty is corrosive in a way that goes beyond any single piece of hardware being knocked offline. The Growler, confirmed, central, and not exactly a secret. The aircraft doing the heaviest lifting in the reporting on this campaign is the EA-18G Growler, the U.S. Navy's dedicated electronic attack variant of the Super Hornet. Multiple defense outlets and mainstream reporting describe Growlers, flying from carriers, including the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford, as the platform tasked with jamming Iranian surveillance and fire control radars and disrupting communications networks in the opening hours of the campaign. One defense analyst quoted in coverage of the operation called the Growler the indispensable ghost of the campaign. While the B-2 and F-35 provide stealth, the Growler provides what he described as electronic superiority, actively blinding the sensors that might otherwise detect those stealth platforms. That much is well documented and not particularly controversial. Growlers carrying jamming pods alongside AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles capable of physically destroying radars that dare to keep transmitting have been photographed launching from carrier decks specifically in support of this mission. The doctrine described, a networked formation of Growlers projecting what's sometimes called a protective electronic umbrella over strike packages, is consistent with how the Navy has talked about this capability for years. Where the story gets murkier is in the specific hardware being credited. Some reporting describes the jamming pods involved as the next-generation jammer midband, a genuinely real program that reached operational status on Growlers only recently, intended to replace the older ALQ-99 system that's been in service since the 1970s. The real, verifiable claim about the NGJMB is that it uses modern active electronically scanned array technology to generate more powerful, more precisely targeted jamming than its predecessor, and that it's designed to be more effective against frequency-agile radars that hop between operating frequencies to evade older fixed-band jammers. That much is grounded in the program's actual design goals as described by the Navy and its contractors. What's harder to verify, and where a lot of the more dramatic online coverage starts to drift from confirmed reporting into something closer to speculative technology journalism, is the specific claim that this system uses artificial intelligence to learn and adapt in real time, growing measurably smarter with every single mission flown against Iranian defenses. That's a genuinely appealing narrative, and elements of it are plausible, given the broader direction of military electronic warfare research. But the specific operational claim, stated as settled fact, that Iranian radar operators are unwittingly training an American AI system every time they turn their equipment on, is the kind of detail that shows up in enthusiast defense blogs more often than in on-record statements from defense officials. and it deserves to be treated as an interesting possibility rather than a confirmed battlefield fact. The cyber layer. Running alongside the jamming is a second layer that gets described consistently across more credible sources. Coordinated cyber operations, aimed at Iranian command and control and sensor networks, timed to hit in the same window as the electronic attack campaign. This is documented well enough that it has its own dedicated tracking by researchers studying the cyber dimension of this war specifically, who described cyber and electronic warfare capabilities as having been integrated into the opening phase of the conflict to disrupt Iranian command structures, communications, and sensor networks before the kinetic strikes began. The logic behind combining these two layers is straightforward, even without the more speculative technical embellishments. Jamming attacks the radar at the sensor level. It doesn't matter how good your radar is if the signal you're reading back is buried in artificially generated noise. Cyber operations attack the network level. Even a radar that somehow manages to generate a valid contact has to get that data to a missile battery through a communications link. And if that link has been compromised or severed, the contact never translates into an actual intercept. A radar that works and a missile battery that works, with a broken connection between them, adds up to a defense network that can't do the one thing it exists to do. The Chinese hardware question. Here's where real caution is warranted, because this is the part of the story that tends to get repeated with much more confidence than the underlying sourcing actually supports. Some reporting has claimed that Chinese-supplied radar systems Iran had integrated into its network, including systems marketed specifically for detecting stealth aircraft in lower frequency bands, failed to perform effectively against the American electronic attack systems arrayed against them. The specific claim is that these systems, intended to close a gap in Iran's coverage against low observable aircraft like the F-35 and B-2, turned out to be vulnerable to exactly the kind of jamming and suppression tactics the U.S. had already developed to defeat them. If true, that would be a genuinely significant data point about the real-world combat performance gap between a system's advertised specifications and how it actually holds up in a sophisticated electromagnetic attack environment. And it's the kind of thing multiple governments watching this conflict, including Beijing, would have every reason to study closely, regardless of how the specific claim is eventually verified. But it's worth being honest that this particular claim traces mostly to specialist defense industry outlets rather than confirmed government statements or independently verified battle damage assessments, and claims about specific percentage figures for radar coverage degradation in the opening hours of the campaign fall into that same category. Plausible, consistent with the broader pattern, but not something that should be repeated as a hard, confirmed number. What's solid and what isn't? It's worth drawing a clean line here between the two categories of claim running through this story, because conflating them is exactly how a real, well-documented capability gets inflated into something closer to science fiction. Solid and well-sourced. The doctrine of suppressing and blinding air defenses before committing strike aircraft is decades old and well understood. Growlers flying from U.S. carriers played a central acknowledged role in the opening hours of this specific campaign. Iran's internet connectivity collapsed to a small fraction of normal levels in that same window. Senior U.S. military leadership has stated on the record that coordinated cyber and space operations disrupted Iranian communications and sensor networks ahead of the kinetic phase, with the explicit goal of leaving Iranian forces disrupted and disoriented. Plausible, but less verified. The specific claim that next-generation jamming pods are using AI to adapt to Iranian radar behavior in real time and improve mission over mission. The claim that specific Chinese-supplied radar systems failed outright against American countermeasures. Specific percentage figures for how much of Iran's early warning radar coverage was degraded before the first strike aircraft arrived. That second category isn't necessarily wrong. Some of it may well turn out to be accurate once more rigorous. Independently sourced battle damage assessments become public if they ever fully do. But right now, a lot of it traces back to a small number of specialist defense outlets citing each other, rather than to on-record statements from people with direct knowledge and no obvious incentive to make the story more dramatic than the facts support. Why this matters? Regardless. Strip out the speculative layer entirely, and there's still a genuinely important story here. Every government that has invested heavily in a radar-based, network-centric air defense architecture, and that's most serious militaries on Earth, has reason to study what's documented about this opening phase closely. Not because it proves any single hardened conclusion about the end of ground-based air defense, but because it's a real contemporary example of what happens when a technologically sophisticated adversary commits fully to attacking the electromagnetic and cyber layers of a defense network before ever engaging it kinetically. That's a genuinely different kind of vulnerability than the one most air defense planning has historically focused on, which tends to assume individual radar sites or missile batteries as the unit of attack, rather than the network's connective tissue itself. Whether Iran's specific hardware choices, including the Chinese systems it integrated, made this particular case worse than it needed to be, is a real and legitimate question. Just one that deserves to be asked with the same skepticism applied to every other unconfirmed claim in this war, rather than accepted because it fits a satisfying narrative about the limits of a rival power's technology. The war. This opened. It's worth placing this electronic opening in its actual context, because the campaign it kicked off turned out to be one of the most consequential military operations against Iran in decades. Operation Epic Fury, as the US codenamed it, running alongside Israel's parallel Operation Roaring Lion, didn't just target radar networks and communications infrastructure. In the days that followed the February 28th opening, the campaign also struck Iranian leadership directly, and Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed as part of the broader operation. Iranian naval assets took heavy losses in the same window, with US officials at one point describing the campaign as sinking or critically damaging some 20 Iranian naval vessels, including a submarine. That context matters for understanding the electronic warfare piece specifically, because it wasn't a standalone demonstration of jamming technology. It was the opening layer of a campaign whose kinetic results, in terms of both military infrastructure and Iranian leadership, were severe enough that most other coverage of this war naturally focuses there first. The electronic and cyber suppression campaign is the part that made the rest of it possible, or at least made it dramatically easier, which is exactly why it deserves more attention than it usually gets, even if the technical specifics of exactly how it worked remain harder to pin down than the outcomes it enabled. The part worth sitting with. The most useful thing anyone covering this topic can do right now is resist the urge to round every plausible claim up to a confirmed one. The electronic warfare campaign against Iran's air defenses in the opening hours of this war appears, from everything that's actually well-sourced, to have been extensive, coordinated, and significant. Whether it was also the flawless, learning, ever-improving machine intelligence described in some of the more enthusiastic coverage is a separate question, one that honest reporting on this topic should keep clearly labeled as unresolved, right alongside everything else in this war that official sources on every side have reason to describe more confidently than the facts currently allow. This script draws on public reporting as of July 2026 from the Observer Research Foundation, globalsecurity.org, Army Recognition, National Security Journal, Defense Update, and Wikipedia's tracking of cyber warfare during the 2026 Iran War, alongside on-record statements from U.S. military leadership. Claims sourced primarily to specialist defense blogs, rather than confirmed official statements, are flagged as such, rather than repeated as settled fact.